Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our session today. We hope you're going to get a lot from listening to our talk this morning. My name's Victoria Knight. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at De Montfort University in Leicester. Some of you may have heard of Leicester recently. For two very good reasons. We now have a king in Leicester and a really good football team.
Hi from me as well. My name is Irene Zempi. I'm a lecturer in criminology at Nottingham Trent University, but I live in Leicester.
Yeah, okay. Today, just to give you an overview of what this session's going to look like, basically we have 90 minutes, and what we thought today, in terms of what we'd like to discuss, is looking at and examining the role of the self and emotion within qualitative data analysis, and considering, I suppose, our two very distinctive projects. So I'm going to run through. We're going to run through an outline of what this morning's going to look like, and we want to carve out some time towards the end of the session, probably about 20 minutes to half an hour at the back end of the session for what we'd hope is a discussion. Now, you may note that the video recorder is turned on. I've been assured that the video recorder will be turned off once we have our group discussion at the end. So I suppose we could loosely use Chatham House rules, that obviously what's said in the room stays in the room, because we are going to be talking about sensitive topics in terms of our research. And also Irene and I have been thinking about what we're going to talk about today for about a year now, and we're going to be writing a paper on this topic, so any feedback or comments with respect to our content would be really, really useful for us as well. So your feedback today would be fantastic. Irene is going to run through the outline.
Hi again. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, first of all, it's important to introduce our research projects. So in that respect, we would like to give you some background information about our sample, our research aims, and why we decided to use a qualitative research methodology. So in that respect, we are going to outline the theoretical framework of our projects. Also, we're going to look at our multiple identities and how we managed to negotiate these identities during the research process, and specifically in the fieldwork. But also, we're going to talk about our emotions, our feelings throughout the research process. We're going to talk about emotional labor and how we managed these emotions, how they impacted upon the research process and the product of our pieces of research. Moreover, we're going to look at the advantages, but also the challenges, the limitations of using reflexivity throughout the research projects. And finally, we're going to draw up in terms of the conclusions and how you can take this forward within your own pieces of research.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with a quick description of my project. It was a project about prison life broadly. And in terms of the research participants that were included in my study, these were serving prisoners. So I had to visit a prison and gain access to a prison. And I also engaged prison staff within that. Now, in terms of the aims of my project, I was specifically interested in the use of television in prison. Many of you may know or not know that prisoners can access television now in their cells, and this was having an interesting effect on the prison environment. In terms of kind of drilling down in terms of what I was specifically interested in was the role that had on the prison environment, on the prison, on the management of prisoners. And I wanted to particularly explore, I suppose, the relationships that they had with this piece of hardware that was now presented inside the cell. I also wanted to kind of reflect on, I suppose, the social uses of television within the context of incarceration. It's statistically abnormal for a British household not to have a television. It's part of our everyday lives. But in the context of the prison, which is a very peculiar and highly controlled and regulated environment, I wanted to explore kind of the impact that was having on their social life. And in terms of then reflecting back on how prisons themselves were using television as a mechanism of control and regulation. A little bit more about my methodology then. I took an ethnographic approach as much as I could and took influence from wider audience studies of TV from that Sean Moore's work in 1993. And I also drew on Derek Lader's adaptive approaches in terms of managing, I suppose, the design and the implementation of my research strategy. In terms of my sample, I interviewed 19 prisoners, some of them more than once, and some of them also completed diaries for me, and I got them to complete a diary of what they were watching and who they were watching it with. Some of the prisoners that I interviewed actually shared cells together. That's very common, certainly with it in our prisons in England and Wales. And I also interviewed at length prison staff within that. Now, in terms of these interviews, I also engaged in interviews inside prison cells. I spent time mornings and afternoons with prisoners sat watching TV. So some of the interviews were conducted whilst the television was on, switched on, and I kind of included that in my research design. In terms of the research tools that I used, semi-structured interviews, as I said, TV activity diaries, and also observations. I also drew on local policy and national policy to kind of inform some of my analysis as well. So Irene is going to talk about.
That's great. So in terms of my own project, this was basically my PhD research on Islamophobia. In very simple terms, Islamophobia is the hostility, the hatred towards Muslims, specifically visible Muslims, individuals who are perceived to be Muslim, for example, through their appearance. So post 9/11 and 7/7, there has been a massive increase in terms of Islamophobia towards Muslims, and specifically Muslim women who wear the full veil. So that includes the dress, which is called the jilbab, the headscarf, which is called the hijab, and the face covering, which is called the niqab. So women who wear the full veil. And I was particularly interested in their lived experiences in terms of abuse, intimidation, in public spaces. So I was looking at the public space, the offline world, rather than the online experiences. And specifically my research aims included understanding the nature and the frequency of the victimization that they received. Also the impact it had upon themselves, their families, but also wider Muslim communities. Furthermore, their coping mechanisms. So how did they cope? How did they deal with these abuse in public spaces? And finally, the effectiveness of criminal justice responses to these victimization. So for example, in terms of support from victim support, or giving a statement to the police, or going through the criminal justice process in terms of giving evidence to court and possibly being asked to take the veil off. So that's in relation to my research aims and the research topic. In practical terms, I did 60 interviews with women, veiled Muslim women who have been victims of Islamophobia. So I went to Muslim homes, and it was one-to-one and a one-off thing. Whereas I think you said you sometimes returned to the prisons. So it was a one-off thing. And I also did 20 focus group interviews with victims. So I went to mosques, I went to Muslim schools, and I went to Islamic centers. Now, all the fieldwork took place in Leicester, which is ideal because of the high population of Muslims in Leicester. I also did 15 interviews with criminal justice agencies and Muslim organizations. So, for example, I interviewed hate crime officers in the police, victim support, Leicester and Leicestershire County Council, but also Muslim organizations, both local and national. So that was the plan, but the plan doesn't always go according to what we have in mind. So I started doing my interviews, and for me, by the way, that's the beauty of qualitative research. You have the opportunity to make changes. It is flexible, it is creative, and that's why I see myself as a qualitative researcher, and I want to remain like that. So I started doing the interviews. I went to, I was doing the pilot study. And many women suggested that, actually they challenged me, you know, how can you represent our voices? How can you understand our stories? You are not one of us. So I'm not a Muslim, I'm an Orthodox Christian. So my identity, my religious identity, from the moment I entered the field was quite obvious, and I was always very honest as well about my identity as a non-Muslim. So my outsider status in that respect appeared to be problematic in terms of connecting with my participants, empathizing, but perhaps more importantly, telling their stories, representing them. And this is very important if you're working with marginalized, oppressed, underrepresented communities. So they suggested that I wear the veil in order to be able to understand these experiences and do justice to the world behind the veil in terms of Islamophobic victimization. Of course, I did have my dilemmas, and I wasn't sure that this was the right thing to do for multiple reasons. So, for example, offending Islam or using covert research, which I will talk about later on. But to cut a long story short, I did wear the veil, and I used autoethnography in that respect. And it is important to point out that autoethnography is extremely novel in the context of victimization, extremely novel, and for the right reasons. I'm not promoting autoethnography in victimization in any way because of the safety issues. However, I did do it, and I'm happy to share these experiences and talk about the reflexivity aspect of using autoethnography to research Islamophobia and specifically victimization.
Yeah. What we want to highlight now is the value, I suppose, of both of our projects in terms of drawing on qualitative interviewing, and you're going to talk about this.
Very briefly, I feel like I'm an ambassador of qualitative research. So qualitative research, and specifically qualitative interviewing, will provide you with in-depth understanding of people's experiences, people's views, people's motivations, and that is key in terms of getting this rich, thick data with detailed descriptions. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is extremely novel when we are researching marginalized groups, oppressed groups in society, sensitive topics that might require confidential setting. Mm-hmm. So in that respect, prisoners, but also victims of hate crime could be seen as, to some extent, marginalized, vulnerable groups. And another issue is that we tend to use these binary categories of, offenders and victims, but I'm sure you interviewed prisoners who were victims inside prison or, beforehand. And same with my own research. I came across cases of victims who have been involved in offending behavior. So this binary category doesn't always work like that, but for the purposes of this research, if we use this dichotomy, in both cases they could be seen as marginalized, oppressed to some extent, and hard to reach, definitely hard to reach prisoners. So in that respect, we can see how we can empower our marginalized groups by giving a voice to their experiences and using qualitative research and specifically direct quotes is key to empowering the participants and representing their voices through our work, publications, papers, and so forth.
I think it's worth highlighting, obviously, the different debates between the kind of quantitative and qualitative research here, and highlighting some of the differences, and certainly that in terms of justifying a qualitative study, these are, I think, are some of the arguments that are obviously presented to us, certainly in our Viva and in our publications. And I just want to quickly highlight that these are, I suppose, some of the challenges where the positivist camp, who tend to draw on quantitative methods, for example, believe and observe that facts can be measured in terms of numbers, that there is a single truth, and that the researcher has actually no influence over the data collection, and that questions around reliability and validity and representativeness, generalisability and objectivity are all kind of, I suppose, ratified by the positivist researcher. Whereas the qualitative researcher who embraces a reflexive account of their study believes in multiple truths. So, for example, the respondents that we interviewed tell their stories in different ways, but they share common themes. For example, that their life experience is subjective, and also our interpretation as researchers is also subjective. I'm going to talk more about the reflexivity aspect soon. And the point that I really want to make today is in relation to the kind of credibility and trustworthiness of the accounts that us qualitative researchers make. And that I'm going to argue today that by drawing on your own self and your own emotions as a researcher can enhance the credibility and trust. And I'm going to show you how I did that. Well, we're both going to show you how we did that. Something that certainly Irene's really passionate about is this idea of co-produced knowledge. That yes, you are responsible for initiating that project, but with your participants through acts of negotiation and access, that you co-produce that knowledge together, both you and the researched.
Excellent.
Thank you. Okay, thinking more deeply then, and I suppose the point I want to make to you in terms of thinking about your own research projects is to, right from its inception, be attentive to the emotions and the reflexivity aspects of your research right from its inception. It doesn't just start in the field when you're engaging with your participants. It starts from those key decisions. Why on earth are you researching the topic that you are researching? That has an emotive dimension, I would argue. And so having this awareness of yourself is really important in terms of the design of your research, in terms of obviously the data collection and entering the field, Also importantly, and this is where the magic happens in the research, you collect your data, but then it's what you do with that, your interpretation of that information and how you dissect that. Listening to your emotions during that process is really, really important. And so the production of knowledge, the account that you then present back to your community, back to your research participants, back to the public, is also important. And the kinds of decisions you make as a qualitative researcher are actually made, I would argue, through a dialogue with your own emotions. And reflexivity is also necessary in order to demonstrate methodological rigour, and we're going to show you how we did that. In terms of your own emotions, that these have an impact on the kinds of decisions you will make, what you will include in your accounts, for example, how you will gain access, how you will establish rapport with your participants, for example. And I'll give you a quick example. There were some of my participants that I didn't like. I didn't like them, but they were giving me rich stories. And so how did I manage that and negotiate myself in those kinds of relationships, for example? And also in terms of, and I've said about obviously the production of knowledge, that it is emotive. Do you want to add any more?
No, you've covered everything.
Yeah. The point here is what I'm trying to convey is that the role of your research diary starts right from the beginning of your project. So note down how you're feeling about a certain aspect. At the beginning of the project, you don't know what you're going to find out. It can be disorientating. What literature are you going to look at? Who are you going to access? Are you scared about certain aspects of your research? How are you going to manage yourself through that? So use the diary right from the beginning, and the diary ends when you've finished writing up. It doesn't end as soon as you leave the field. Because believe me, and some of you will understand that your experiences of your project continue beyond the field.
So okay, yeah.
Yeah, emotional labour. I just want to alert you to obviously a large section of literature, and that qualitative research does demand emotional labour. And emotional labour is taken from the very famous study that Arlie Hochschild, 1983, The Managed Heart, developed this concept that in certain roles, certainly in paid employment, that we are expected to manage our emotions for the benefit of the people that we are serving. And emotional labour also kind of links to this constant emotional management, and that this tends to occur, according to Hochschild, in paid environments. Now, as a researcher, you will adopt a specific role, a professional role, for example. Some of you may be paid researchers, some of you may be students, for example. But you are adopting, and just to be aware then, that in terms of thinking about emotional labour, that there are certain conventions then that you are expected to behave in a particular way, that you're expected to perhaps not cry during interviews, laugh at someone's sadness, for example, the kind of social faux pas that I suppose are involved there. And Hochschild talks about feeling rules, and as researchers there's this kind of unspoken element to how we should behave within the field, for example, and that we are, as Hochschild says, to induce or suppress our feelings in order to maintain a professional status. Now, we're going to talk about some of that, I suppose, where that breaks down, and some of these ideas are certainly challenged. The point is that as researchers, emotional labour, and there's a very large literature on this, particularly in health studies, certainly in our field in criminology, this is only certainly just emerging. But in terms of working on sensitive topics, for example, and how researchers manage themselves within that. Dixon and Swift talk about the emotion work of research. But emotional labour is actually invisible. You don't see it. And often in methodologies, not much attention is paid to it. I'd say that ethnography is perhaps the largest, I suppose, research strategy that draws on that. But from the beginning of your project, think about this emotional labour that you will endure during your projects, and think about how you want to manage that. Talk to your team, talk to your supervisors, talk to your peers about that. The problem is if you don't pay attention to this aspect of your work as researchers, that it can be problematic for you. And there's much work certainly in health studies when people are researching things like palliative care, people who are dying and the relationships they form, and their participants die, for example, and the impact that then has on the researcher. Also things like burnout, emotional distress, physical discomfort, illness, for example, are some of the things that researchers have written about. But I would also argue that you need to pay attention to the emotional labour that you are engaging in, because it can go unexploited. If you're not paying attention to what's happening to you, then you're not listening to your research sufficiently, I would argue. Okay, our different studies then, in terms of how we managed our identities in the field. For my project, I was entering a prison environment, a male prison environment. I'll just present myself today. I have my legs out, I have some nice pink shoes and a dress, and I have my arms out, looking quite femme for me. But entering a prison environment, I must say that this study wasn't the first time I'd entered the prison environment. I was well versed at visiting prisons. Before I was a researcher doing previous studies in prisons with prisoners, male and female, I worked as a prison teacher. So I was quite well trod, I suppose, in terms of entering that environment. And I suppose that experience meant that right from the inception of my study, even when I was negotiating access for my study on television in prison, I adjusted what I wore. So I would be very conservative in what I wore. I would always wear trousers, sensible shoes, because there's all the slippy environments in prisons for various reasons. So from a safety point of view, but also in terms of conservative dress, I wouldn't wear makeup or perfume when I entered the prison environment. So I kind of downplayed, didn't realise that this is what I was doing, but I certainly downplayed my femininity. And partly this was to do with, I suppose, my knowledge of the environment and understanding the kinds of deprivations that prisoners are endured in. So they wear prison uniform, for example, and if I went in wearing nice outfits, for example, but also the deprivations that they have in terms of the male-female deprivation. So I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I wanted to blend in as much as possible. And I didn't really realise this until I was writing up my study, that this is what I was doing. How I dealt with things like, certainly in interviews, and I said I spent a lot of time with some of the prisoners that I interviewed. I went into their personal space fundamentally their homes, sat with them. They showed me personal artifacts, their photos, their letters. We watched TV together. They made me a cup of tea. And I was obviously asked questions about myself and my life, and I was interested in their lives, but and so I got lots of questions about my own life and how I managed, I suppose, those personal disclosures and dealing with questions. And I took the view that I would, like, if anybody asked me and I felt comfortable, then I would reveal personal disclosures that I thought were safe and considered and sensitive to the narratives that we were involved in. There were also questions about my insider-outsider status and how I negotiated access, for example. I think certainly my past experience allowed me to gain access quite quickly, but also access to the prisoners and also the staff, and how I negotiated their consent, for example. But also that, being female in a male prison environment and never been to prison before as a prisoner, I was certainly an outsider, and Irene's going to talk more about that in a minute. As well, spending time inside prisoners' cells and how I felt about that, and obviously being invited into the prison cells. There are aspects of safety there. I always told staff that was what was happening, and that was agreed. So in terms of negotiating my identity, there were certain things that I adjusted in terms of myself and how I suppose I performed as a researcher in that environment.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, the fact that we are researching two really distinct populations, and in both cases, identity management, performance, appearance are key perspectives in terms of reflexivity. So just to give you a few examples of how I changed my appearance, especially when I was visiting religious places in Leicester, mosques. So I was asked by the imam in the mosque to dress very modestly, and it was very specific. I was asked to wear a very loose, long black dress, which I didn't have, so I had to buy one. And I had to wear the headscarf, and I was not happy with changing my appearance and also wearing a headscarf. On the basis that I was wearing my researcher hat on, and I wanted to keep my identity. I wanted to enter the field as Irene. However, sometimes you need to remember that you might need to compromise in order to gain access, because I needed them. They really didn't need me at all. So I had to compromise that aspect of gaining access. And it wasn't a huge problem, but ethically it could be seen as compromising myself. So I did enter, I did get access to mosques because I did agree to wear this dress and the headscarf. But it doesn't stop there. It's also about behavior. So I was told to avoid eye contact with men in mosques or Islamic centers, which I found very difficult because I'm not British. English is not my first language, and I think we all use body language and facial expressions when we, talk to other people. But for me, that was even more important because I often, use body language and facial expressions, especially if I don't understand someone's accent. So that was another thing that I had to compromise in terms of avoiding eye contact. And practically it was difficult for me to look somewhere else when someone is sitting in front of me. So behavior was another aspect of compromising access to the field. Another interesting aspect which I touched upon before was using my identity to gain an insider's perspective. So as I mentioned before, in terms of my religious identity, I was 100% an outsider. But using autoethnography and wearing the veil allowed me to become at least a partial insider and see the world through the eyes of these women. It allowed me to understand their experiences. It allowed me to feel the fear, the anxiety of victimization, become a victim myself of verbal abuse and physical abuse in one case. So gaining this insider perspective meant that I had to use my identity, and that goes to show that identity in qualitative research is flexible, it is creative. And that's one of the main advantages of qualitative research. At the same time, though, I did use my body as a tool in terms of researching Islamophobic victimization. And I'm not sure if I would do that again or if I did the right thing, but we're going to talk about that later on. So I think there is some literature about using your own body, not necessarily in terms of victimization, but when you're doing research in a specific topic. So
what we were both doing, we think, and we'd be interested in your views later, is that we adjusted our appearances to please others, to maintain access, and to be sensitive to the environment that we thought we were being sensitive to the environment in which we were entering. And it's quite interesting that these pressures to conform, I suppose, are embedded in kind of wider social values and debates about patriarchal society, and certainly feminist researchers may have something to say about what we both did in terms of our work.
Just to give you a bit of an outline in terms of insider-outsider positionality. So insider is the researcher that belongs to the group that they are investigating, they are conducting research with. And key characteristics would be religion, ethnicity, gender, and perhaps sexual orientation. So an outsider means that you are not a member of that group. Now, we acknowledge that this is a very simplistic way of understanding positionality because we are multiple insiders and outsiders. So it's this dichotomy doesn't really work for me. But if we consider the core characteristic of the sample that we are investigating, so in your case, I think gender and also offending behavior and being a prisoner would be the key characteristics. In my case, it would be religion. So in that respect, clearly we were perceived as outsiders by our participants. So although we were insiders in other respects, you had insider knowledge, you worked in prisons, I've worked with victims at victim support as a practitioner, so I already had some knowledge. However, at the end of the day, we were outsiders in that respect. And the literature does show that insider researchers are more able to understand, to empathize, to accurately represent participants' experiences. So there are definitely advantages and disadvantages in that respect. However, it is definitely very, very useful to be an insider researcher in terms of these core characteristics when you work with marginalized, oppressed, hard to reach groups such as victims but also prisoners.
I think the other point as well is that I think that where we're at the moment with this debate about positionality is that it's not a dichotomy, that you use it and negotiate it constantly and it kind of blends into. And certainly how I conceived it with my project is that there were some aspects of my work through the life of my project, not just in the field, where I needed to be close. But I had to remind myself that I had to look at myself and my research data with a critical lens. So taking that step back and looking at what you're doing and, you know, moving away from and taking a critical overview is also important. So you use that in your project at different stages. Just to give you some examples then, and we've talked about ourselves quite a lot, and certainly in relation to my project, here's some examples certainly of the kind of emotive expressions, and these quotes are when I coded up the detail. Boredom was, my study really is about boredom. You know, Leon saying boredom is poison, it's mental poison, you can easily get distressed and suicidal in here. Very emotive, thick descriptions of how that's felt, and certainly all of the respondents felt they knew that I was an outsider, and they had to really work hard at trying to describe to me what boredom is like in the prison context. It's different, we've all been bored, but being in prison, it's hyper boredom, it's constant, it's unrelenting. And so for Carlton, the TV feeds his brain just a little. It's occupying that boredom, it's delaying it, it's minimising it, it's reducing it. And for Mick as well, he felt that he has no structure or routine, that the prison routine is very monotonous, and so TV, you know, helps shape that, but also remind him of the routine, you know, things are on at a certain time. And he talks about not having enough sleep at night. And oh, there's Shameless. He was happy that Shameless was on Tuesdays. It was the highlight of his day, his week even. And then he talks about soaps, were particularly important for prisoners, and so the excitement from that narrative that was felt, and obviously my connection with these dialogues is also important. That, you know, and certainly I discussed with Mick. I liked Shameless. I really enjoyed it. You know, we had a shared viewing repertoire together, and we could talk about that, and prison documentaries. So
great. So that's me in the Vale. In terms of visually capturing, you know, the field work, it might be something that you might want to try as well within your own research project. So as you can see, that's me in full veil. So that's what I wore in public places in Leicester. The field work took place for 4 weeks. So for a month, I wore the veil for a month. And that was in 2012, around, I think it was March or April time. And I also used a diary to reflect upon my own experiences, what happened to me in the field. And I took a few pictures. Actually, it was a participant who took the pictures showing my face as well, but that's how I was dressed in public. That's for the purposes of identifying that it's me, really. And also, you did ask me whether I bought the full veil. I was actually, I borrowed it from one of my participants. So that's the visual representation, if you like, of the fieldwork. And you mentioned that it's something that we need to consider beforehand, because it's difficult to go back in the field and, you know, take pictures or different decisions that we need to make. So it's important to be aware of these issues before and act accordingly. In terms of my experiences, I did experience verbal abuse, threats, name calling, and the language that the perpetrators used revealed their hate crime motivation and revealed their hostility, their hatred towards Islam and Muslims. So, for example, being called a suicide bomber, a Muslim terrorist, or comments like "will burn your Quran." These are clear examples of Islamophobia. However, Islamophobia was also tied in with other forms of hatred towards, for example, foreigners or immigrants, which has already increased in terms of the Brexit vote. So, for example, I was told to go back to where I came from. So it's not just about Islamophobia, it's also about racism and xenophobia. But also sexism. So I wrote a number of comments about my gender and whistling and intimidating comments in that respect. But also the last example about whites not being meant to be Muslim. I think it's not just about being perceived as a Muslim, it's also other aspects of identity that might come into play, which refers to this notion of intersectionality of identity. So, for example, I am white, and this was visible from my hands and the area around the eyes. So, being white, I was called a traitor because there was this assumption that I had converted to Islam, because the vast majority of Muslims are from the Asian community. So if you are white, you're automatically perceived as a convert. So I was commonly called a traitor, as if I have betrayed the Western values or Christianity. So these are some examples of the verbal abuse. In terms of physical attacks, remember, I only wore the veil for a month, so I can guarantee that if I wore it for longer, I would have more attacks in terms of physical attacks. So it was very common. I only had one example where I might read that actually. So I write in the diary, I felt quite upset as a car drove past me on Saffron Lane, that's in Leicester, and very close to my house. I live in Aylestone. And a white male threw eggs at me, and then he shouted something about Muslims. I was so shocked that I didn't manage to get the car's number plate. After this incident, I felt so dirty when these people did that to me. It was so humiliating. And it was in a public space. So being victimized in front of other people who just, walk away. They don't even ask you if you're okay. It was very humiliating, and I felt very, very dirty. In addition, and I think that was extremely common, persistent staring. And it wasn't staring out of, interest. Sometimes I might stare at someone because if it's something fashionable and it's out of interest, but that was staring with hatred. Also being ignored and being laughed at. So, for example, I was in the fruit market in Leicester, and the person there, I wanted to buy some fruits, and they refused to serve me, and I was so angry, but also again humiliated and ashamed because again it was in a public space, and I felt very weak. And that's the place where I work. I used to work at the University of Leicester at the time, and I live there, so it's my home. Leicester is my home, and being treated like that was really, really hurtful. And I started to have feelings of us and them. And I started to feel isolated and angry towards that community.
Okay, so then a culmination then of all these experiences through our data collection, and I think Irene's data there, autoethnographics, is very, very powerful. And so what do we do with these kinds of responses or experiences that we have, and how does that then affect the production of knowledge? Now, this is just to give you an example of what I did, certainly in the stages of analysis, and I used Derek Lader's process, the adaptive approach. And so this was at the point where I'd collected my interviews, and I moved through the different phases of analysis. And what I did with my research diary was actually list how I was feeling about these different stages of my work. And so, you know, as you can imagine, you know, I've just got my data and I'm transcribing this excitement, a little bit of sadness, you know, hearing some of the narratives was certainly felt. A little bit of shame because I was a free person, that my life was certainly much more enriched compared to some of the narratives that I'd heard. I explained I didn't like some of my respondents. One, I would call him a misogynist. He absolutely disgusted me. You know, I had these feelings. I noted them down. So moving through these different stages and then beginning to slice up my data and get, you know, sort of code up my data. I'm going to talk about jealousy in a moment, and that was a key emotion. I did something really important with that, as well as discussed. So the point is here that there is some value in noting down these, and I'm going to show you more in a moment. Guilt was also very important to both of us in our research, and we did important things with that guilt to, I think, to better influence the robustness, the credibility of our work. And I made key decisions because of this guilt that I made, methodologically speaking. So just to give you a visual example of that, and note these down in your research diary.
So we're going to explore these feelings and emotions in more depth with examples. So shall I start with that? So in terms of guilt, I think when I started the research, I felt very, very guilty because I was an outsider. I felt I wasn't good enough to research Islamophobia because of my outsider status. But I used that feeling of guilt to enhance the methodological rigor of my research. I tried to think of ways to enhance the accountability and the way it has increased my responsibility to do justice to participants' voices. So I became more committed to make it right despite my outsider status in terms of, you know, connecting with the participants, engaging with them, making part of the research, asking for advice, you know, reading further upon. So guilt could be a starting point, but perhaps you can change that into a positive thing and you can use it to benefit rather than obstruct access or, you know, the progression of your research.
For me, aspects of duty of care, and certainly this was amplified when I interviewed prison staff, and some of the narratives that I got from prison staff in terms of how they manage prisoners and what they do with prisoners and how they conceive TV within that. Realising that society's broad view is that, you know, what on earth are our prisoners doing getting access to TV? It's a contentious issue. And so I felt I had a duty of care because of this guilt towards them and in order to protect them. So within my publications later on, and certainly in the thesis, is I took the choice not to name the institution where I did the research, and also I carefully anonymised references to names and places. So I made some key ethical decisions there. I was also worried about and often challenged about the usefulness of my research. What's the point in researching TV in prison? What's that going to achieve? And I'm going to reveal what's happened since later. But at the time, yeah, I felt guilty about that. Self-indulgence, yeah, for my PhD. So, yeah, I felt guilty about that. I was also worried about contaminating these rich narratives that I've got, you know, through the analytical process of breaking down that data that you do as researchers. Was I going to tell the story back that was accurate and credible? So I made some key decisions to triangulate much of my different data sets, so to triangulate the prisoners' narratives with the prison staff's narratives and the diaries, and draw on wider policy and some of my observations. So I became almost obsessive, double checking, am I right in making these kinds of assumptions? Is my study about boredom? Yes, everybody was mentioning it. What's the relevance of that? So I was very active in cross-checking and triangulating these accounts there. So I think guilt, without that feeling of guilt, I don't think I would have done or made these kinds of decisions. So listening to yourself motivates that. And certainly your respondents throw up.
And we were saying that in the coffee shop, we were saying if we didn't have this feeling of guilt as a starting point, would we be so passionate and committed to making a difference for our participants? And the answer is probably no, I think. But it's being aware of these feelings where you can use them to benefit the project.
Yeah. Sadness. We both experience sadness, and certainly there's this idea of exploitation, certainly on both sides, and the role of rapport. And certainly as a female, wanting to obviously listen to people's accounts, and to what extent do I show empathy? And I remember one individual talking to me about his life. And it kind of contextualises with my own position in my own life at that time, and his story kind of still stays with me today as well. So what sadness did was alert me to the emotional labour that I was experiencing during this project. Do you want to talk about immoral?
Yeah, but I also wanted to add that we have debated this issue whether we have exploited our participants and use empathy and sympathy as a tool to make that connection and then progress our careers, have publications, do papers in that respect. And the answer is I don't know. I don't know whether we have exploited our participants. But that's why we're here to share these concerns and debate these issues. In terms of this notion of immorality, and I think this was very obvious in my case because I did use covert research, I did not reveal my identity as a researcher to members of the public when I was in the fieldwork. However, on the one hand, it is ethically dubious in terms of deception. However, if I had revealed my identity, it is highly unlikely that people would reveal their true colors. So in that respect, it was something that I had to do in order to guarantee the success, if you like, of the fieldwork in terms of exposing Islamophobia. However, I never revealed any of the participants' names. I mean, I didn't know people's names. It was random people on the street, but I could have recorded them. I was actually offered by the BBC to do a documentary where I would have a hidden camera and walk on the street, but I refused to do that. I think that's beyond, ethically, that would be inappropriate because you need to have consent in that respect, showing people's faces and who they are. I don't know if I would be comfortable with that extra step. Yeah. I also felt feelings of guilt and as a result sadness because I felt that I lied towards Muslims who thought I was a Muslim myself and they would greet me on the street. So I would say, salam? Yeah, that's it. So I had to say that because being fully veiled means that you're part of that community. So people would say hi all the time to me. And I felt that I deceived them in that respect. I also felt guilt and sadness because I did deceive the public as well, and some of them were the perpetrators. But I think the worst sadness for me was towards myself, because I deliberately, so on purpose, I used my body and I put myself in a situation of danger, not only physical but also emotionally and psychologically. Although I'm not a Muslim, it did affect me being called these names and being threatened. So it did have a massive impact in terms of depression and so forth. So I haven't still forgiven myself, and I don't know if I did the right thing. But again, that's why I'm here, to have these discussions, and you can learn from my own experiences, and I can learn from your feedback.
Jealousy was something that I certainly experienced in relation to people's situation. Bizarrely, I was jealous of the amount of time some of my respondents had. Being a full-time worker, I got a young child at the time, trying to do this study, being time poor. I was very jealous, I must admit, of their situations. But what that amplified for me, thinking about this critically, is that it alerted me to the context of being in prison, that these men had nothing to do. And it amplified that. So it took me to the literature about the pains of incarceration. So it actually moved me to the wider literature about the psychological deprivations that prisoners endure. So in that sense, it enhanced my knowledge because I had this feeling of jealousy. I was also jealous of people's clarity and conviction. And I was disorientated. And as researchers, you will be disorientated. And I admired people's conviction and clarity about their life positions and what they believed in. And I was still, my research question was still hanging. I'd not answered it yet. And I was jealous. I wanted to answer it. I wanted to know. And even my supervisors knew, but I didn't know, And so I felt disconnected and alienated. I was angry at those who knew. When you get asked, so what's your PhD about? I don't really know. So reflections of yourself and how you compare yourself to others, certainly in academia, that we're always compared and peer reviewed, aren't we? And I was jealous of those that had achieved, and so they were. That was an important emotion, certainly for me. There's an example there of Leon talking about how he very clearly knew what TV was for, and I admired his conviction. So just to give you an example, it is available. Shame, yeah.
And you did touch upon the criticism from fellow academics, but also the participants. So in some cases I was challenged by my participants who said that you can't wear the veil, that's part of practicing Islam, like the 5 pillars, and fasting during Ramadan and praying 5 times a day. It was almost as if I was immoral by wearing the veil. So it wasn't a consensus view amongst my sample that it's okay to wear the veil. So I was challenged, and I think in some cases they tested me. And I don't think I challenged them back. I did stand my ground in terms of wearing the veil for the fieldwork, but I didn't feel powerful enough to fight for wearing the veil. Another issue of criticism is being criticized by fellow academics. And just to give you an example, a few months ago I gave a presentation on autoethnography, and a really high-profile academic criminologist who I have a lot of respect for said that this is not real data, and that was in the audience now. So again, it was quite humiliating because it was in front of other people as well. So being judged and criticized, and also our reputation comes into play. So in that respect, it can be difficult to be challenged, through our papers or giving presentations or putting our reputation in line when we do, research on the edge, if you like.
I was worried about getting it right and not misrepresenting the participants in my work, and there were also, as well, sort of misquoting and behaving, I suppose, a little bit like a journalist, and taking those sexy quotes that you get, because you do get them, don't you? And so I took decisions like to include quite large chunks of quotes in the write-up of my work. And the reason I do that is that I don't want to misquote people. I want to contextualise what they're saying. So I made a decision to do that, so to use large quotes was an example, but also slicing up people's lives. So I don't want to make a comment just because somebody said one thing. I don't want to then say that the whole data set claim it. So I was very careful in saying, look, this is complex. I never took that positivist position as well. And so I was very careful about the story in which I told there. And I suppose there's something to be said about all this, that the criticism that you can get in terms of, are we navel gazing, are we being self-indulgent researchers? And I think what I'm trying to get across is that listening to these emotions, this aspect of shame and getting it wrong, was very, very powerful. It made me a better researcher. More robust methodological decisions that I made in terms of managing that data set at the analysis stage, and certainly at the write-up. There's another quote here from Simon, who was very testing. He it was a partial interview with Simon. He ended up interviewing me. Very clear, and I think this was one of the most important interviews I had in relation to thinking about the value of my work, and he challenged that, and that's where the interview broke down. But I think he was a very, very important thing, and about not getting it right, he forced me to I've got to get this right. So those, when interviews go wrong, can actually be quite powerful, and it certainly was for me.
And was it one of the best interviews, you said, that in terms of what you got out of it?
No, I think the incident of the interview breaking down and him asking me, what on earth are you doing this study for? You're not going to do anything, and so what, So I think those questions were really important.
Fear, I mean, again, in terms of autoethnography, I did give you a glimpse of the abuse I got in public places, and obviously I was very fearful for my life, and knowing the extent of the problem from the interviews that I had with women, I knew that I could be one of them. So I felt quite fearful. However, during the process of the fieldwork, I suffered in silence. So I downplayed the severity and the extent of the problem from my supervisors, my friends. I didn't tell my parents. And I was afraid that they would stop me from the fieldwork. So when I would speak to my supervisors, I would say, everything is fine, nothing really has happened, nothing major, I'm absolutely fine. So I downplayed the significance of the abuse I got, because I feared that I would be stopped from the fieldwork. So in that respect, I did suffer in silence. However, when I started presenting this work, writing about this work, I found it very liberating, very cathartic. So being here and sharing these experiences with you helps me to deal with them, if that makes sense. Although for a few years I did suffer in silence, and also I didn't really include these experiences in the PhD, because I felt that it would again contaminate the value of the research. So although I did acknowledge it, I didn't really expand of my experiences. But I found the confidence to do that after the PhD. So the thesis is not everything in relation to your research project. There are many things that you can cover, after you publish your thesis. But also losing myself. So I only wore the veil for a month, but that was so powerful that I started to lose myself. So my perceived identity as a veiled Muslim woman seemed to overcome and be more dominant than my true self. And that's why I decided after a month to take the veil off. I felt I started to lose myself, my true identity. So it was time for me to take it off. In terms of the emotional, psychological impacts, I did touch upon, depression. I felt isolated. I started to feel angry towards, members in the local community where I live. And also it affected my physiological my lifestyle physiological. So physiologically, I couldn't sleep well. I lost my appetite. I didn't want to leave the house. I didn't want to speak to anyone. I became very withdrawn. But also that connected me to previous experiences of victimization that I didn't really face in the past. So we have been, I think we have all been victims of crime, some crime, or maybe we have been offenders. So I think through our research process and project, maybe it might open up Pandora's box, and you might have to face previous experiences of victimization or offending behavior. And if you haven't dealt with these issues beforehand, maybe that's the time to deal with them and confront them.
Yeah. Great. I think there's some questions around power, and Irene and I have been talking about, who has power. And again, a little bit like the insider-outsider dichotomy is that, is it the research participants? Is it the researcher? And there's lots of debate about this. And in terms of, challenging your participants, certainly with the misogynist I talked about, I was sat in his cell and he was showing all his photos of all his sexual conquests. He was very explicit in his descriptions of what he did with these women. He talked very graphically, even though my study didn't request this in terms of my schedule, about his offence, that he was in for a graphic, violent offence. And I challenged none of that. And it's interesting, I think, reflecting on that, in any other circumstances, would you challenge, his attitude towards women, for example, there? So there's some questions around power and about maintaining access. To what point do you go to get access and to maintain access there? And also about, obviously returning to the field, maintaining that rapport with your participants and the gatekeepers. For example, I clearly had to satisfy security access. I was able to draw keys. I had to, as well there. But there's this idea, and I come back to this idea of co-production, the co-production of, and certainly in participatory research where knowledge is actually co-produced right from the inception of a project, for example, there, that some of you may want to draw upon that. The empowerment of the researcher through your feelings and empathy and responsibility, and what you then do with those voices, how do you present them back, and taking responsibility for that. It's you that creates the research project there. Having a commitment to, I suppose, make a difference both nationally and internationally. And given our early concerns when we were in the field, what's the value of your work? Both of us now, I'm currently advising the National Offender Management Service, both here and examples abroad, on their digital strategies and media provision in prisons at the moment. So my work is actually informing current policy and practice in relation to that. Irene?
I sit on the Telemama board. I've done research projects for them. I also sit on the hate crime scrutiny panel for Leicestershire Police, for Nottinghamshire Police. So I work with the communities that I feel I'm serving. But also for me, using autoethnography meant that I am now one of these women. Although I'm not a Muslim, I care as if I am a Muslim. And I don't know if I hadn't used autoethnography, whether I would have this sense of commitment and passion to make a difference and to keep these women safe.
Yeah. And what's interesting to policymakers and practitioners and also developers, I'm working with a lot of companies at the moment, they design and develop digital platforms potentially for our prisons. They're interested in, well, what happens to the user, so they want my knowledge to inform the development of their products now. So I think what we're trying to say is that both of us, in doing qualitative research, there is a value that we've helped to carry these voices towards
absolutely
informing, I suppose, decision making. There's also questions around intersectionality.
And I think I did talk about that briefly in terms of how our different perspectives, like our occupational status. Yeah. Being a researcher at the University of Leicester, I was seen as a legitimate person for my participants. Also being female, I think that was important to gain access. I think if I was a male researcher, it would be more problematic in terms of access to Muslim women who wear the face veil. Also my perceived sexuality, if I was perceived as homosexual, women would need to wear the face covering during the interview. That is, if they decided to give me an interview, because the purpose of wearing the face veil is to prevent any sexual thoughts of in terms of interaction with the other gender.
That's okay. Yeah. Just to conclude then, just some benefits, I suppose, of the kinds of approaches that Irene and myself have taken is to be alert to your performance of identity within your projects. Listen to that. Note it down. We've suggested taking photos of ourselves and respond to that within your project. I would strongly argue, and I showed you the analytical process that I moved through, and that those emotions guided the kinds of decisions I made with respect to enhancing the credibility and trustworthiness. And Clive Seal's article on quality and qualitative research certainly guided me there. And without those emotions, I don't think I would have provided such a trustworthy account, because of the triangulation decisions I made, having multi-methods, multi-samples, for example. What reflexivity does is obviously enhance the depth and complexity of our social worlds that we are researching. It contributes to realist research, that it's grounded in certainly your work, the experience of engaging engaging is probably the wrong word, but being a victim there. The kinds of ethical decisions I made were certainly alerted by the emotions that I felt. Not to name the prison that I did the ethnographic study in. I was careful how I certainly handled the participants, particularly staff within that. So I made some sound, I think, ethical decisions, and how I then continued that in terms of the writing up and the stories the narrative that I presented back to the public. And I learned a lot about myself.
Me too.
And you certainly have, haven't you?
It is a learning curve. You learn about your participants, but also about yourself, definitely.
Yeah. Some of the challenges then, just to reiterate that, is that some of the challenges is, are we... we're having to satisfy these rationalist camps, not to engage in our emotions, that that research should be clean of and be absent from those discussions. Irene talked very vividly about breaking down, just to be aware that, you know, listening to people's narratives, particularly hard to reach vulnerable groups, does take its toll on you as a person. You will be disorientated through the life of your project. You will experience that. How you handle that, for example. You need to come up with strategies, have things in place. Criticisms, again, about going native and becoming the insider, for example. Questions around navel gazing and self-indulgence, and, you know, where do you write these accounts? Should it be in your methodology? Should it be within the discussion? Should you be writing a paper on this, which we're considering? We're going to do. And researchers' therapy, you know, think about the motivations, why you're researching the topic that you're researching, and the role that you will play within that, and the kinds of boundaries there. Something around friendships, and certainly in ethnography, there's very vivid accounts. Adler, for example, who did some very famous research back in the 70s, 80s, on drug taking. You know, they took drugs with their participants, hung out with, you know, and had relationships with them. Yeah. So, you know, it's not unknown. What are your boundaries in terms of your research project? But there's a risk there. Certainly visiting the prison, it certainly didn't happen in this project, but it's happened outside this project, where prisoners have made requests to me. Can you get me this? Can you get me that? So you need to work out what those boundaries are. Just some quick conclusions, because I'm conscious we've really dragged on. Sorry. Emotions as a guide, really, and I think that's what we want to convey in terms of obviously sharing your research experiences, and we hope that by listening to us today for a very long time, well done, from each other, and be prepared for these when you enter the field. Developing coping strategies. I was super fit in this project. I just used to run. Developing coping strategies. And in terms of quality and rigour, there's some literature, some growing literature out there about how you will manage quality and rigour in qualitative research. And I've written about this in my own work. And offering a trajectory to the research process and moving through those different phases. And I suppose what I would want to impart is that should begin right from the inception of the project, and be alert to your reflexive self and your emotions right from its inception, and the kinds of ethical discussions that you make, the decisions you make should be informed, you know, on a moving scale as well. Do you want to add anything else?
No, I think we've covered everything.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Some references on here. Do get in contact with us if you want. We're both on Twitter. We've both published as a result of the two separate studies that we've talked about today. And if you don't want to buy the book, you can hear me on Radio 4's Thinking Aloud. I was on a few weeks ago talking about the project, and there's a link there if you click onto that. I think you guys can access these PowerPoints, I think. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you again. That's fine.